Fans of the Horus Heresy and Warhammer 40,000, thank you very much for joining me for perhaps the most preemptive piece of rules analysis in the history of Warhammer 40,000. That's right, we're going to do some 8th edition rules analysis today before the game has even been released. Goodness me, I'm going to get an absolute hammering in the comments, aren't I? Anyway, right, let me explain the premise of this video. As we've been getting the posts on the Warhammer community website about the changes in 8th edition Warhammer 40,000 rules, there's been lots of changes that we've got visibility of prior to the game's launch. The general mood on these changes, I think from what I've seen, has been positive, and a little asterisk there to set aside anything to do with lore, and in particular Primaris Space Marines, because that is a topic for another day. But just in terms of the rule mechanics, I think the changes have gone down well, and from my personal opinion, I've looked on the changes in a very favourable light. I think they're good. If you listen to my videos regularly, you might have heard me mention that, I don't know, a year and a half, 2 years ago, me and a few friends made a list of what we would change in 7th edition. And it's quite interesting that all those things have been addressed pretty much by the 8th edition changes we've seen so far. From my point of view, 8th edition is looking good. However, there is one change which has not garnered as much positive response, I think, from commenters I've seen, and that is to do with the changes to vehicle damage. And this focuses purely on one particular aspect of vehicle damage, which is the concept of having different armor facings for different sides of a vehicle. In 7th edition, we have a system whereby the vehicle has a front armor value, side armor values, and they can be different. There is one odd example of that, but they can be different, and then a rear armor value as well. So this has allowed the rules to be constructed in such a way that actually for most vehicles represent quite a plausible system of armouring, whereby the front has heaviest armour, sides have got weaker, and then the rear has the weakest of all. And this, for anyone who knows anything about real world tank design, is quite realistic. There are a handful of examples that don't conform to this profile, and the obvious example is a Land Raider, although there is actually a real world comparison, a conversion of the Israeli Merkava tank, which has been converted into a very heavily armoured troop carrying vehicle, which from an armour point of view is actually not a million miles away from a Land Raider. However, it lacks the armament. In 8th edition, there will be no more armour facings. Vehicles will have a single toughness value, a single saving throw, and a number of damage points, or a number of wounds as they're going to be called. Compared to what we had in 7th, this is clearly a loss of detail, and it's not as realistic to have vehicles with equal armour and saving throw on all sides. It just simply isn't. This is a change that hasn't garnered as much positive response, and I feel the same as well, because as I say, I appreciated the realism factor of having different armor facings in 7th. However, I'm now going to argue actually the opposite point as to the fact that I actually think, having thought about this for a few days, I think the proposed system for 8th is actually better than we've got in 7th, because there are a number of flaws with the rules in 7th, hence the title of this presentation, 7th edition armor facings on vehicles, rules problems, which, unless addressed, mean that if the existing facing system carries forward into 8th, we're going to carry all the same problems with it. And these problems are, well, they are notable. And I'm going to go through these in sequence, and we've got all sorts of stuff today. We've got a bit of high quality graphics, we've got some models, we've even got some diagrams as well. I mean, I've completely pushed the boat out, so we're going to do that. I've got 5 reasons and then the concluding remark. We're going to do this in what one of my university lecturers used to call overhead striptease. So I'm going to reveal these one at a time, and then we'll go through the reasons behind it. So if I don't knock the tripod anymore, let's go to reason 1. So the first reason is this: armour facings are not definitively constrained. So what do I mean by that? In 7th edition, there is a rules principle that is used to determine facings. And this is stated in, I just forget the page now, just a single statement. And it says that you create the front, side and rear arcs of a vehicle by drawing lines between the 4 corners of the vehicle. Sounds simple? Yeah, it does sound simple. However, it is entirely left to the player and players to determine what that means. We don't, at no point has Games Workshop or Forge World ever given us a diagram for every vehicle in the game and every walker and every titan to show what their interpretation of the facings are. So I'm going to give some examples now, and I'm going to start with straightforward examples, but then I'm going to move on to examples which illustrate the inconsistencies of this rule and actually create problems as well. Let's get some diagrams. So what I've done is I've been through my collection of vehicles and I've just traced out a plan view of them. So these are like boxes, and then I've just drawn on the arcs. So here's the first one. So we've got a Rhino. So here's my plan for Rhino. So we've got, as you can see, we have the front, the rear, name, Rhino Demos. We have the complete arc for the front facing, so this is 61 degrees, and the complete arc for the side facing, that's 119 degrees. The opposite angles are obviously the same. The rear is 61 degrees and the port side or left side is 119 degrees on this Demos. If I just grab said Demos itself, you can see I've done something like this, and what I've done to determine that is I've taken the corner point here, these corner points. So anything that trails out the back, I've kind of ignored, and that doesn't really matter on this. And pieces of armour that don't carry all the way to the corner I've ignored, and obviously things like mine ploughs I've ignored. And that, I suppose, straight away we've got a statement there of making an assumption about what the fire arc or the armour arcs are like. But for a vehicle like a Rhino, that is fine, and there's nothing particularly unusual there. Let's take another example. Here we have a Land Raider Proteus. So the front arc here is 58 degrees and the side arc is 122 degrees. Again, this is an armoured Proteus I've used, so I've ignored the sponsons and I've taken it to the front edge of a track unit. And let's look at another good 41st Millennium example, and that's a Land Raider Phobos. And we get a bigger plan view, but a very similar arc to the Land Raider Phobos, only slightly narrower on the front armour. Let's do one more, let's do something. I'll do a couple more. Then you've got a Spartan, or a Cerberus or a Typhon chassis. And then just for something whoppingly large, and this is Legion Fellblade Glaive or Falchion. And that's obviously a Marine super heavy vehicle. You can see with these guys, actually, all of the front arcs are the front and side arcs are actually quite similar in pattern. The smallest arc is 57 degrees on the Phobos, the largest arc is 61 degrees on the Rhino. Not bad really, actually, they're quite consistent. You think, so I hear you say, oh, Leakycheese, so what's the problem? Well, let's have a look at a couple of problem examples. If problem candidate number 1 would like to step up. And here we have a Cerastus Knight Atropos. Right. So, where is the arc on this? And here we have an example that in my mind is open to interpretation and it is not clear as to what it is. So we could say, okay, well we could say we'll take the carapace, so the arc looks something like that. You could do that. However, I could equally argue, well, actually I'm going to take the corner, the nubs of these shoulder plates, because that then encompasses part of the arm. And then your arc becomes something perhaps like that. Another player might argue, well, I'm actually going to take halfway along the shoulder pauldrons, and then your arc might become something like that. You can't use the base because there is no definitive way of mounting a Cerastus or indeed any Imperial Knight or any other equivalent vehicle on a base, because as you can see with this pose I've created here, it requires a base to be mounted longitudinally as opposed to transversely. So yeah, don't know the answer to that. You can certainly interpret it, however it's unclear in my mind. Let's take an even more wacky example, and here we have a Mars pattern Warhound Titan. It's a Leakycheese channel mascot. Now this one in my mind is an absolute pain to try and get this right on, and I basically just assume the old 6th rule. 6th edition, it was clearly constrained what the arc was, or it was unequivocally constrained, because it was you centered on the vehicle and it was 90 degrees, so like a cross arc, so 90 degrees forward, left, right and back, constrained and consistent. Right, so where is the corner, front and back of this vehicle? Is it the nose? In that case, then it's got an absolutely insanely narrow front arc. Is it the edge of the front carapace to the back of the back carapace? That gives an arc, something like that. Or is it in the front of the carapace to the rear of the exhaust unit? Then you get a very peculiar tapered arc like that. What about the shoulders? Should it be the rear of the exhaust to the shoulder block? Then we get a very favourable arc from the point of view of the front arc, narrow sides and a wide rear. What about the arms? If we take it to the front of the arms, then you get something like perhaps that. Now, any one of those can be argued to be correct. The plan form of the Warhound Titan is such that it is unclear as to what the arc is using the corner-to-corner rule. And you could take exactly the same example with the Reaver Titan and the Mars Warlord pattern Titan as well. And I'm sure a whole host of other Eldar, Orc, and other races, vehicles as well. I mean, the Tau Manta, there's another one. It's not properly constrained, and therefore it's open to question. To address that in my mind, which is an unequivocal rule, 90-degree arc centered on the vehicle, or GW clearly defines it per vehicle. Well, Forge World as well. GW and Forge World clearly define the arcs per vehicle. That's the first problem. The vehicle's facings are not properly constrained. Now let's move on to the second problem with the 7th edition rules. And this is, some GW bases make placement problematic. What do I mean by this? Not all GW bases are symmetrical, and that causes issues with posing a model. And we're going to bring in our Knight Atropos model again to illustrate this point. And why does this matter? Because when you have a terrain setup, if a model needs to be mounted on a base, it affects how it can be positioned. Now, in GW, I suppose you don't have to mount anything on a base, well, certainly the vehicles. However, a model like a Cerastus Knight or an Imperial Standard Knight it's not going to be a great model if it hasn't got a base to support it, because it's rather top heavy, particularly the Standard Knights. So let's bring our Atropos in. So as I said before, my Atropos is in a striding forward pose, and this is at the limit of what the legs can achieve. And because of that, I've done this longitudinal mounting of the base. You could have a pose where this base was rotated 90 degrees and mounted transversely. Now I'm just going to grab a couple of bits of improvised terrain, which was the first thing I could find when I was looking around. And we have a Forge World box, and we have a copy of Joe Haldeman's Peace and War. There you go, a little bit of sci-fi for you. Let's just imagine that these two are buildings. Right, in the battle, our knight advances down here. It can only just fit between those two. Because of how it's mounted on the base, it means there's not really much room to maneuver it. And that really constrains how you can then face your armour. If, however, this knight had been mounted the other way around on the base, then if I wanted my armour facing forwards, that would work rather neatly, wouldn't it? And there'd be no confusion. So that's another issue with the system, the fact that you can have inconsistencies with how models are orientated on bases affecting their placement on the table. With tanks, this doesn't tend to be quite such an issue because every tank's the same in terms of its footprint. And let's turn this around as well. If we imagine, if we just sort of like turn it, if we rotate this through 90 degrees, now the Atropos is advancing down the street. Let's imagine there's enemies that way, and I want it facing that way. Well, great. It fits perfectly. However, my friend who's mounted like that, thunk, 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 he has to put his side armour on to go there. How do you remember and how do you exactly know what your facing is? That is an issue that with friendly gaming, I don't see it as I'd rarely see it as being an issue. However, in competitive situations, and perhaps with members of a WAC community, that could be problematic. Let's move on now to the third problem. So this kind of stems in a way from what we talked about in a moment ago, which was walkers have no torso twist for armour facing purposes. Most walkers are articulated at the waist, and had I been so inclined, I could have put this guy rotated through 90 degrees and it would have been fine. Now, in the rules it says use a head for determining the orientation of the model, but Why? This is a walker, a machine that can clearly twist its torso, and it can probably rotate it at least through 180 degrees. But while we might be able to do that for firing, we can't do that for shot placement determination, and we always come back to the facing of the head. This affects a whole host of units in 40k. We've got the Dreadnoughts, got the Night Titans, and then we've got the Battle Titans ranging from the Warhound all the way up to the Warlord. Obviously very unusual specific units, however, particularly at a Dreadnought scale, that's something that we run into all the time. That's another issue with the Vehicle Armour Facing rule, the fact that you can't declare that your, let's say, Dreadnought has rotated its torso in a particular direction. That would lock you for your fire arcs, but then it would also affect you for your incoming fire as well. Right, oh gosh, nearly, a little bit too much striptease there. Let's move on to point number 4. This is one of my favourites, and I got one of you guys to thank in the comments for asking me a question that led to me coming up with this name. Facings are set by the sculptor's fancy. What does that mean? Well, with my initial set of examples I gave around the Space Marine vehicles, they all have quite similar armour arcs. However, that is not universally the case, and some vehicles are extreme either way. Let's just bob our Rhino on and our Land Raider Pro. Let's do a Land Raider Phobos, right. So that we've got 2 nice well-known examples. Now I'm going to put a load more exotic ones on to illustrate how the way the sculptor makes vehicles affect the armour arcs, and then I'm going to come on to how that actually creates an inconsistency in gameplay. So here we have a Krios pattern tank. So this has got a narrower frontage at 55 degrees and then 125 on the side. A Sakaran main battle tank. That again is kind of like similar to its other Legion contemporaries. Again, a bit more extreme now, a Triaros armoured conveyor from the Mechanicum, or equally Karaknos assault tank. This is only 49 degrees on its forward facing and 131 on the side. So this is quite a long, narrow vehicle, and that diminishes the effectiveness of the flare shield mounted on this vehicle. Now we can get into the more wide, weird and wacky ones. So here's another example of, well, how do you determine the facing? This is a template for Coronis Grav Carrier. It's got quite a wide front arc at 68 degrees, 112 on the side. However, that's according to my interpretation. Now, corner to corner, the Coronis has got these long engine nacelles with these rounded fronts. So where's corner on here? Is it here, or is it the corner here? I've taken here down to here, but then it's also got this big tailing body here. So that's my interpretation, and I think that's reasonable. However, you know, you could argue against that. You could say, oh, you've got to take it to maybe, I don't know, here to reflect for this bit, or you have to do it to the front of a nacelle. So yeah, that's another odd template. And there's a load of vehicles I don't have, and I imagine things from the Dark Eldar are particularly weird in this regard, and Necron maybe as well, and there's some funnies in the Eldar. So yeah, just Imperial vehicles. Okay, so how low can we go? Right, here we have the arcs for the Dracosan armoured transport. This would equally apply to a Malkador tank or any chassis vehicle in that respect. And here, the front arc is a mere 43 degrees and the side is 137 degrees. So this is a very narrow, and I think this is amongst the narrowest ever made. Let's go completely the opposite direction and look at the Macrocarad Explorator for the Mechanicum. Here we have an absolutely enormous 71 degree front arc, and the side arc is merely 109 degrees. So this is extremely wide. So there's quite a variety there. As I said, with the marine vehicles, they seem to be quite consistent. Things like the Mechanicum and the Talons of the Emperor and the Solar Auxiliary, we've got some more weird and wonderful things. Now, straight away, I would say, okay, so these vehicles with the wider front arcs benefit from their front armour facing more than the ones with the narrow front arcs. Yeah, obviously. In the case of a Macrocarad, stock, it doesn't matter because it's got armour 14 all around. However, the Coronis does benefit. Nice big wide arc means its heavier front armour gives a greater benefit relative to, say, the Krios or the Solar Auxiliary Dracosan, which has a considerably better armour arc than it does. So while they both have the same armour value of 13, the Coronis is better protected in general because of its wider arc. Still, you can there's an argument to say, well, all of these facings are built into the basic points value of the unit, and I don't know. We can only assume that answer to be yes. However, it hasn't been factored into additional defensive equipment. So, and let me give you, and the example actually very neatly falls with the two extremes. There's a Dracosan and the Macrocarrid Explorator. The Macrocarrid has, nearly 30 degrees more frontage. So it's, I don't know, it's about 3/4 bigger front arc than the Dracosan. The Macrocarrid has the option of taking a flare shield for 25 points. The Dracosan has the option of taking a flare shield for, guess what, 25 points. If we ignore the fact that this has got a heavier front armour than this anyway, if we just look at the degree of protection that flare shield will provide, it's worth more to the Macrocarrid than it is to the Dracosan, because of the fact the Dracosan's front arc, which is the only arc the flare shield protects, is so narrow compared to the very wide front arc on the Macrocarrid. Despite of that, they're costed at the same level. That doesn't seem right to me. Well, it clearly isn't, because one piece of equipment is more effective than the other because of the sculpting of that vehicle. So that's just a handful of examples there, and I'm sure if you look to your own collections, and particularly if you've got things outside of a heresy, you may well find even more examples of this sort of peculiarity. Right, so that's my fourth problem with armour facings in 7th edition. The fifth and final problem is due to the vehicle movement system being simplistic, and in particular around the fact of how turning works or doesn't work. Basically, in 7th edition, if you can fit a vehicle in a space and it's got enough distance to move it, you can move it. And it doesn't matter what its initial orientation is, and it doesn't matter what its final orientation is. Very simple. It completely eliminates any mechanics around turning. Nice and simple to play. Well, actually it's simplistic, and let me show you why. This was a tactic I first observed, and we're going to be helped by our Rhino Demos. So it was a Rhino, it wasn't a Demos that was offending in my particular encounter. I first came across this when I was playing an opponent who was fighting with a Grey Knight force in 40k, so already there was a whiff of fromage across the table. As he advanced his Grey Knight, his standard Marines, he'd bought them Rhinos, and he did this. So on his first turn, he went to here, and then he turned his vehicle, and he got some guys out behind it. I was like, okay. In his next turn, he moved another 6 inches, and he just did that. So the Rhino is side slipping forward. In reality, and the reason that the player was doing that was to take advantage of the wider side armour facing to give more 5+ cover save to his guys behind, as opposed to having a less favourable cover, piece of mobile cover that way around. Well, what's the problem, I hear you say? Well, because there's no turning mechanic, firstly you can do that, and then you can do that in the next turn with no move penalty. Whereas in reality, ending up in that position would force the vehicle to stop. It would then need to rotate on the spot, accelerate, brake, rotate on the spot again. All these things would slow the vehicle down enormously compared to if it was just travelling forward at a normal speed. And there's no differentiation between a standard move where you go that way or that way. However, this way you can exploit the lack of a turning mechanics in 7th edition, exploit the Rhino as a cover providing vehicle. And there's not a whole load of vehicles that you would necessarily do this with, but there are vehicles that you can do it with, and in particular the Rhino is a fairly egregious example. I mean, and the other thing, realism wise, why that shouldn't happen is no crewman is going to do that. All the sensory equipment and vision ports are going to be located in the front arc of the vehicle to give the crew the most information, because you can't do that all round. It's an armoured vehicle, it's protected. Whose interest to keep orientated towards the enemy as opposed to doing this? It just doesn't make sense from the point of view of how the crew would act either. Now, if in 7th edition there was a rule to say you may make one 90-degree turn for free, it would stop that happening. Or if there was a rule to say if for every additional 90-degree turn you make, for every 90-degree turn you make, you lose 1 inch of movement, or every additional turn you lose 2 inches of movement. But those rules don't exist in 7th, so it allows for that sort of silliness to take place. And yeah, it just takes away from the game in my point of view. Not a problem for friendly play. I've never, it's not something I have a problem with friendly play. When things get competitive, sometimes I've seen people do that. It's just like, that's cheese, isn't it? Ironically, in 1st edition, where where the 8th edition damage system is coming from, directly lifted from, not 2nd edition, it comes straight out of 1st edition, a turning radius ratio rule that prevented you doing that. And basically it would mean that if your Rhino was traveling at a certain speed, it would kind of have to move like this. It couldn't go like this and do sharp turns, because it would have to accelerate, turn on a ratio and then stop. The rules did change and you got a slightly different take on that, but there were still rules later on in 1st edition, and then when you went into 2nd, I believe, if I remember rightly, that limited the number of turns you could make with vehicles, and it prevented this sort of, well, the side slipping silliness I described there. If 7th had rules like that, I wouldn't have a problem, but it doesn't. So yes, so there are my list of 5 issues with the 7th edition rule system. Armour facing system is fundamentally flawed at the moment. And to take that forward as a system, all of these 5 would have needed fixing. Now, they can all be fixed. We've had some solutions in the past that have worked, and there's nothing there that can't be written rules for. However, to write the rules from will probably, in most instances, add complexity. Let's just move and have a few concluding remarks. Oh, look at this, zooming in. Okay, so in conclusion, so 7th edition armour facing system is flawed, and for the 5 reasons I've set out. You may have some additional reasons to think of, and you know, these are just what I could think of. If you can think of anything else, maybe you disagree with one of these points, I don't know. If so, you know, I'd love to hear your perspective on particular, you know, what I've identified as the flaws. But in my, you know, from my experience and in my understanding, those are 5 flaws in the rules that get in the way of the armour facing system working consistently and fairly at all times. The final remark, or my final concluding thought, is while the vehicle damage system in 8th edition is simplified, it fits the overall game better. So with the level of complexity we have in 40K, adopting a single toughness and save value and making directions and making vehicles facingless from a point of view of damage is a better mechanic overall. So there you go. That's my thoughts. Do you agree? Do you strongly agree? Do you strongly disagree? Do you venomously disagree? I don't know. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this in the comment section. I don't think there's anything we're going to do now. I think this is coming. However, I did think it would be useful to have a video considering the true position in 7th, so we can contextualize the changes proposed for 8th. Thank you very much for listening. I'll speak to you next time, and goodbye.